Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Matthews, the editor of Answers Magazine, and tonight we are privileged to have Henry Smith, the author of Archaeology's Lost Conquest, from the latest issue with us to answer readers' questions and explain more about defending the Bible, especially as it relates to archaeology and evidences for the events in Genesis being true. Good evening, Henry. Great to have you with us. Without any further ado, Henry, if you could just give us a little bit of background about yourself and the organization you work for.
Sure. Well, first I want to say thanks for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak to followers and fans of AIG. It's a privilege to have written for the magazine, and I'm grateful for it. I work for the Associates for Biblical Research, which was founded in 1969. I've been there about 10 years. My official title is Director of Development, but since we're a small ministry, wear a lot of different hats and have been involved in our research related to the conquest, particularly related to our archaeological dig in Israel and the city of Ai in Joshua chapter 7 and 8. And so ABR, for short, for our ministry, Associates for Biblical Research, our main core of our mission is to do archaeological research and provide information to the body of Christ to demonstrate how the Bible is historically accurate in the archaeological record, and also to answer the critics who say that various aspects of the Bible are incorrect and that archaeology has proven X, Y, or Z about the Bible is wrong. Through good, solid historical archaeological research, always having the Bible as the ultimate authority and foundation for all that, but also doing good, scientific and scientific research in the work of archaeology. So, like I said, we've been around since 1969, so quite a long time, and I've been there about 10 years. I also have a master's degree in theology and business background, and then I'm just about ready to finish my second master's degree at Westminster Seminary. So I'm getting sort of multiple education through ABR and Westminster at this time. So learning a lot about archaeology, and we're doing a lot of work over there in Israel.
Great. So actually, so what digs have you been on? Can you, if you can't recall them all, can you give us a few examples?
Well, for me personally, the first dig I went on was at the city of Hatzor, which is, and it was a very significant city in the northern part of Canaan during the time of the conquest, and many centuries before that even. So I spent some time there as a volunteer, and then I've worked on the ABR's dig a number of years at a site called Khirbet El Makader, which is mentioned in the article, which we believe is the city of Ai. So I'm sort of in some ways in training, archaeologically speaking. My colleagues have more experience than I do, but I'm currently a supervisor at our dig in Israel, and learning a lot each time we go out into the field.
Well, very exciting. I'll be interested in learning more about you, but we certainly want to answer readers' questions, the direct questions first. And one of them, two of them we have is not directly related to what was said in the article, so we'll come back to those. One of them is related to the time period. Let me just read it. What extra biblical evidence has been discovered regarding the giants in the land, as reported by Moses' original 12 spies and later historical books of the Old Testament during the period of the conquest?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's probably numerous ways to approach it. When you read in my view, when you read the narrative of the spies' report, they try to say that the Anakim are the Nephilim. And of course there's a long discussion there about the spies and all that. We really haven't found anything in the archaeological record of large humans or anything like that to sort of speak into the stature of the Anakim that I'm aware of.
Okay.
So certainly the cities mentioned in that narrative are important, like Hebron, but not the giants themselves, as far as I know.
Well, I'm working off of memory. How many giants were there? Was it six? Um, we're only talking about a handful of giants as far as we know out of the entire population of billions. And human bodies don't get preserved that often. And in
Right.
fact, if the Israelites killed them, they probably did, which they did, they probably wouldn't have preserved them in any way that we would find. But that's me speaking.
Yeah, it is. It is. The percentages are pretty low. In terms of archaeology, we find a lot of stuff, but we're only excavating a very small percentage of what human civilization has actually existed in the past. So, um, what the exact stature of the Anakim were, and when the spies gave the report, how big they really were, uh, we're not 100% sure about that. So. I'll have to say that I don't have any knowledge archaeologically about any discoveries along those lines.
Well, that raises a related question for me, um, and that is, do we have any way to know remains from what would be a Hebrew versus what would have been a Canaanite? And do we have any human remains from that time period of any kind?
Yeah, I would surmise that the only way that that could be done definitively is if they could find DNA, perhaps in bone marrow. I don't know enough about the science of that to know for sure, but if that could be discovered, then it could be compared to maybe a person who is a modern Jewish person, perhaps, and made a comparison. Now, as far as tombs go, lots of tombs discovered in Israel, tombs at Jericho, many places tombs have been discovered in these ancient cities. So we do have records of that all throughout the Old Testament and down into the New Testament period. Tombs that are excavated. Sometimes they find pottery. Sometimes they find the body. Sometimes they'll find artifacts. And of course, most famously, we find tombs in Egypt of the pharaohs. So a lot of interesting stuff has come out of tombs, but in Israel proper as well.
Good evening, everybody. This is part two. We had a temporary delay because of technical difficulties. And for those of you that miraculously did what I said and got some coffee and hung in with us, we will try to answer your questions, and I'll get right to them in case you've been sticking around for that. The first question is about the Exodus. Is there any evidence, Henry, that you know of that supports the Exodus? The author says, I believe the Bible, but in secular high school, we're always told that the Exodus never happened. I figure that there would be some type of evidence for the Exodus. So what, beyond what you've argued in the article, if you want to summarize the article too, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I think it's an excellent question, and it's a question that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Christians have on their mind. What people usually mean when they're looking for evidence is an inscription in Egypt that describes the events. Um, the problem with that line of thinking is that the Egyptians believed that what they wrote in stone for the pharaohs carried with them into the afterlife. And so we just wouldn't expect to find an explicit written record by the Egyptians outlining all the terrible things that happened to them during the time of Moses. However, that being said, what we would be looking for is evidence that's consistent with the Bible in the location that the Israelites were in, the material culture they lived in, and so forth. And in that case, there's actually been an enormous amount of material that's been found in Egypt, in the Delta, in an area called Tel El Daba, which is the land of Goshen, which is where the Israelites settled during the sojourn, during the time of Jacob, Joseph, and so forth, and down till Moses. And there's been significant discoveries found in the Egyptian Delta that are consistent with the Israelite sojourn and then eventually the Exodus. A lot of evidence of a palace in the Delta near the Nile River, all dated from the time of Moses. A lot of evidence of material culture in the Delta from people that the scholars refer to as Asiatics, and those are people from Canaan that are not Egyptian, living in the Egyptian Delta during this time period. And we believe that those depictions found in Egyptian records are actually, in part, Israelites. And so, to summarize that very briefly, the archaeology has been done in the Delta in Egypt for almost 50 years now, and there's just a lot of secular archaeologists digging there are not making these connections, but we at ABR have been watching that closely and have published a number of articles. There's a lot of very encouraging information coming out of that work that I think supports the background and the material culture that Moses and the Israelites came out of. An explicit inscription, no, but we wouldn't expect to find that. And even if one was recorded, the possibility of finding it is very low anyway. So our website has a number of articles about that issue. If people go on at BibleArchaeology.org and just type in Exodus, you find some articles related to that I think are encouraging apologetically and archaeologically.
Very good. Thank you. Another one's related to your article. Says your article is about Jericho and the fact that Bryant, who is now what's his official position at ABR, the president?
He's the director of research.
Okay.
At ABR. Yep.
So it says, why are archaeologists so slow or reluctant to affirm Bryant's work at Jericho, and conversely wanting to accept and embrace Kenyon's findings, which have since been refuted as demonstrated by the pottery? Also, how can we participate in a dig?
The great questions. You know, it remains. I mean, obviously, you could evaluate the spiritual dimension of it and the issue of the truth of the Bible and man's tendency to suppress the truth and that. And we know that ultimately that spiritual element is behind all of it. But humanly speaking, or from a scholarly standpoint, it really is difficult to fully understand what the resistance is all about. You know, if the evidence is clear, you know, one doesn't have to, if one is afraid of, you know, the Bible or afraid of the God of the Bible, even if you accepted Bryant's conclusions, that, you know, that doesn't even necessarily mean that you necessarily have to accept the spiritual message of the Bible, although we would want people to do that, obviously. In some ways, it is a mystery. Kenyon's conclusions about Jericho are held dogmatically by most archaeologists and a lot of Old Testament scholars. And in fact, there's excavations going on at Jericho now by the University of Rome, an Italian excavation, and they're doing excellent field research, but when you read the stuff on their website, it's just in lockstep with Kenyon's date. And I'm not sure how we get out of this quandary except to keep working hard at showing what the problems are and hoping a new generation of archaeologists will be more open to hearing what Bryant's analysis shows, because it's really powerful stuff, but it's been met with fierce resistance, and so it's something that has been difficult.
Well, ABR, you're associates, right? You have some people that work with you but not under you. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so some ABR associates show up regularly, and do they even do presentations at regular archaeological meetings? And have they ever done something on Jericho?
Yeah, we have staff members who work for the ministry, and then we have associates who are people that we in part are training and working with to teach them about archaeology and the Bible, and to also, you know, encourage them in the faith and raise up a new generation. there are a couple of folks that have done the Joshua presentation, myself and one of our associates named Doug Petrovich, who actually has done a lot of research on Egypt, which I mentioned before, the Exodus and the Sojourn. So we're trying to get the word out as best we can through our team about the work that Bryant has done at Jericho with the Jericho information, and hopefully it'll hold sway. Now, to quickly answer the other question, we have a dig in Israel, and that's related to the conquest of Ai, which is in the article. And if you go to the footnote number 11 in the article, it has the website for our archaeological dig. So if you've ever dreamed of going on an archaeological dig and you want to go on one that's going to edify you and actually believes what the Bible says, prayerfully consider joining us next year. We're going to be digging for 3 weeks instead of 2, and there's a variety of ways that people can participate in that. So if Lord willing, the person who asked is welcome to come.
Excellent.
No experience necessary.
Just willingness to work out in the sun and sweat.
That's right.
So, okay, so there is a dig going on right now. That was another question at Jericho, and it's sponsored by, say that again?
It's the University of Rome. It's an Italian excavation. That information can be found online. You can find some of their reports and that sort of thing online.
Are there any, other than the one you all are doing now at what you believe to be AI, are there any digs being overseen by people who are clear believers in the biblical chronology and the record in Genesis?
Well, yes to the first part of the question. I'm not sure about some of their position. Some Christian archaeologists, but their views on the early chapters of Genesis, I don't know for sure. I know Dr. Steve Ortiz is digging at Gezer, which is a very important site and is mentioned in the Bible. Solomon built fortifications at Gezer, and those have been discovered there. And Dr. Ortiz is an excellent field archaeologist and believes the scriptures, but I don't know what his views on the early chapters of Genesis are.
Okay.
It is rare to find both. Most Christian archaeologists that I know of either don't delve into the issue of creation or believe in an older Earth, as far as I know. I'm not saying Dr. Ortiz is that case. I don't know for sure.
Okay. No, I was just curious, mainly if anybody was looking at sites associated generally with the conquest, or I suppose with the early Judges period.
Yes. There's a dig at Hatzor going on too, and that's being done by an Israeli archaeologist. He believes in the 13th century conquest, not 15th century, but nonetheless, it's a great dig if you like archaeology.
So you give the argument that some people who want to accept the biblical account say that the 480 years are rounded, and so they argue that the Bible's true, but it was always meant to mean something around the 13th century instead of the 15th centuries when it occurred. Do you mind kind of summarizing those arguments? Because I think it's sometimes hard to follow. Why would somebody read 480 years and get something around 300 years? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a twofold answer. I hope I can make it clear. The first part is how they deal with the text, and that is came up with this idea of the 480. I've read some commentaries that say it's a quote unquote suspiciously round number, so it must have some other meaning to it other than the straightforward meaning, and so a couple of scholars have come up with the idea that it represents 12 ideal generations, which is an ideal generation being 40 years. That's not found anywhere in Scripture, by the way, but nonetheless, that's the way the calculation is done. And then somehow multiply the 12 times 25, which is a real generation, and thus you come up with 300 years. Now, the person listening right now is scratching their head going, what in the world is that? That sounds very convoluted. And I agree that it is. Now, to answer the second part of the question, it goes back to excavations being done in Israel and the expectation, and I deal with this in my article, that you would have this large population influx leveling all these cities and destroying Canaan and then reestablishing a new culture. And so when they couldn't find it in the 15th century BC, they found some evidence of violence during the Judges period, a couple of destructions of a city here and there, and then they began to say, well, maybe it happened in the 13th century based on the archaeological interpretation. Then went back to the scriptures and went through this whole sort of jumbling of the 480 years and so forth. I know my answer is a little bit long-winded. I'm trying to make it as concise as I can, but those are the two factors that played in. It looks like the archaeology was influencing the interpretation of the text, and then you get this wild interpretation, which just doesn't have any warrant when you look closely at the Hebrew. It's actually, and when you calculate it, it's really 479 years. It's an inclusive year. So the number's not even a round number anyway. When you actually do the calculation, it's an inclusive year. So it just doesn't hold up to good exegetical scrutiny of the text, and the archaeology doesn't fit anyway.